Welcome back, everyone, to our monthly Lunch and Learn sessions. As many of you know, these reviews focus on discussing issues that women are talking about, in particular, building financial confidence and creating a life that allows you to thrive. The sessions that we've covered over the last 18 months have completely ranged in topics and themes, but I think nothing more important than this topic of women's safety and security, and in particular, financial abuse. If you're joining us today, it's possible that this might be an issue that you have been impacted by, or perhaps someone in your network of family, friends, or perhaps colleagues may have been touched by. To you, I want you to know that we stand with you, and this is a beautiful and safe community for you to be with here today to hopefully take away some tools, some support, and some inspiration from hearing our incredible panelists today. We appreciate that it might be a challenging topic, so if at any point in time you need to step away, take a moment, please do so. Dial back in later or watch the recording in your own time. But just know there's support available. Maggie's popped the link up on screen right now. So please make use of the services that are available. While the session will skim the surface of the complexities that this issue covers, we know that we'll be following up with resources from our wonderful panelists, Westpac and Ruby, after this session. So a big thank you all for joining today. Thank you to our panelists. I'll hand it back to you to get started. Thanks, Meggie.
Thank you so much, Kira. I so appreciate you. And we are very much looking forward to today's conversation, a very, very important one about financial abuse. Welcome to everyone, and thank you so much for taking time out of your day to have this conversation. It's not always easy, and we appreciate you taking the time to learn more about this topic. So let me very quickly introduce to you our fabulous panelists. We don't have a lot of time. We like to stick to a strict schedule, so we've only got half an hour today. Feel free to have your lunch. If you've got kids with you, if you've got dogs, parrots, they are all very welcome. This is PG content. Catherine, I am so excited to have you joining us today. You are joining us from Westpac as the Director of Customer Vulnerability and Financial Resilience. Can you give us the Cliff Notes tweet-sized version of your career and your expertise before we kick off the conversation today?
Yes, thanks very much, Meggie. And before I start, I'd really like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I am sitting today, and that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So I started my career as a journalist. I've also worked in federal politics, and I've worked in not-for-profit for UNICEF Australia. I've worked across construction, contract mining and process engineering. And then I ended up working in banks. It's been quite a diverse career. One of the things that motivates me is my passion for giving a voice to those who might not have the privilege that I do to make some change by using their stories and their experiences to drive better outcomes for all Australians.
Well, it is a pleasure to have you with us. I really appreciate that, Catherine. Lula, welcome to you. We're so grateful that you can join this conversation. Kira and I were just delighted that you had the time and capacity to share with us a little bit about the amazing work that you do in gender equality, and also to share with us a little bit more about your story.
Thanks, Meggie. Yeah, I'm Lula, and I'm a survivor advocate of child sexual abuse and also child domestic violence and adult domestic violence. And so I bring to the table my lived experience and expertise, and I'll share with you some of the content as it relates to these matters today. And in my professional life, I've had a bit of a checkered past myself, Catherine, if I could put it that way. I've worked in the music industry, also for a brief minute with the paparazzi, which was a lot of fun, where I fell in love with Kim Kardashian before she was the Kardashians. But beyond that, I worked for the federal government in strategic and national security policy, always with a gender lens on that work, in gender equality action planning and women, peace and security. I've taken that work into the not-for-profit space, established my own social enterprise to reframe how we look at the issues of domestic, family and sexual violence, from being seen as a women's issue to really being seen as an issue of the perpetrator, and in most cases a men's issue or a man's problem. And in my day job, I am what they call a gender equality practitioner, and I work for Women's Health in the South East, my lovely mandalas, as manager of gender equity. So working with organisations, again, to do gender audits, to understand the impacts impacts they can make for their workforce, to close the pay gap, and all that kind of jazz. So it's a lot of fun, and I deeply love it, and I'm privileged to be with you today. Thank you.
Well, and we love the work that you're doing, Lula. And yeah, there's a lot that we could talk about, and I'm sure we will talk about today in terms of gender equality as well. And last but by no means least, the wonderful Professor Supriya Singh is joining us today. Thank you so much for joining us. You have had an amazing career and done fascinating research specifically into money and the role that it plays and how that actually changes in terms of families and marriage. So I'm very excited that we've got you and your expertise joining us today. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks, Maggie, for having me. This is really exciting with so many wonderful women. And the fact that we are talking about it, I think, is a great step forward. Thank you so much.
It is an important step forward, isn't it? And I thought what we might do, Catherine, I might start with you if that's okay. I'd love to sort of set the stage a little bit for us here. We're talking about financial abuse. What exactly are we talking about when we say the term financial abuse?
Let me first say what we're not talking about.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Professor. Hang on, Catherine, I'm going to go to you and we'll come back to Professor in just a moment. Go ahead, Catherine.
No problem. So financial abuse is where somebody controls somebody else through their money, through access to money. It can often be interchanged with the term economic abuse as well, which is also controlling the means by which you can earn money. The way we think about it in banking is someone is coercing you to take out debt potentially, or limiting your access to a bank account, or being able to use your money that you earn, or they might then use our technology to send abusive messages and do those sorts of things. So there's a lot of different facets of it in a banking context, but really it's around not being able to have access to money to live your life because somebody else has taken that away from you.
And just before, I want to hear from you, Professor, and also Lula in just a moment. But before we do that, Catherine, specifically for people who are listening today who may have experienced financial abuse themselves, they may be worried that they're observing it in someone that they love, a friend, a colleague, a family member. Practically, what does this look like?
So there are a number of ways that...
All right.
So there are a number of ways that people might experience. I think one thing that I would say is we have specialist teams that support customers who experience domestic and family violence and financial abuse. Quite often a bank is the first place that somebody may contact to say, I want to escape a relationship, or I need to work out what's going on with my finances. So I need to get access to money to be able to leave that situation. They may not actually realise that they're experiencing financial abuse as part of that relationship. I think Lula and Supriya will probably be much better placed to describe that than I am. But I guess what we see is that there may be a conversation that we are having with those customers, and as they're talking, they're realising that there's more to this than they actually understood.
Lula, I want to bring you in here because I want to understand from you, some people, and we know that it is overwhelmingly women that do experience financial abuse. A lot of people struggle to realize that it's happening to them. They don't actually identify the signs. Can you speak a little bit about that from the work that you do, Lula?
Yeah, I'd just like to highlight that, I think the issue of financial control and economic abuse is so important because it really highlights one of the gender drivers of violence against women. It's really about men's control of decision making and limiting women's independence. And that's so crucial. We see that happening. You can understand how access to those resources and assets is a key pin of what drives and how abuse is enabled. And for myself, I've had 2 adult relationships where I've experienced financial abuse. I've never experienced economic abuse because I've always been able to work outside of the home, but it was the dynamics within the relationship that meant I wasn't able to fully exercise my independence around how I use that money. And red flags for me, looking back, with my husband, now ex-husband, was he one time quite early on in our relationship spent the rent money. And so it came down to me to cover all of the cost of the rent. And so he would be irresponsible with his money or spend it on things that I wasn't aware of. And it would come down to me to use my funds. And I was always employed, always felt capable, always ran a budget. I am not someone that you think, oh, maybe she's just not coping. Not at that at all. But he would do that and then make it really hard for me to challenge him on that. And he would go into shame or anger. And I just got to the point where I was like, I don't want to fight with you about money. So many couples break up about money. I'm here, I'm in this marriage, I'm committed. I don't want to fight about money, so I'm not going to address it with you. So I just took it off the table. His abuse of his role in our relationship that drastically undermined my security and our kids' security. He ended up hiding debt from me over a period of 10 years. We lost our house. So, I'll cry because it still really impacts me. So he would undermine our security and our ability to build a life together. And I had no means of addressing that with him in a way that felt safe, because it would become an argument or it become really tense. And there was never physical violence, but it was just that matter of, I want to keep the peace in my relationship and I want us to be happy and healthy and able to work as a couple. But I couldn't do that while he consistently, over 13 years, undermined our financial security to the point where we lost our house.
Oh, so Lula, I really appreciate you sharing your story, and I know that it's not easy, and I wish I could give you a virtual hug through the screen. And I just want to say, Lula, thank you for sharing that, because it's not easy. I can only imagine how challenging it is for you to speak publicly about this, and we appreciate it, because in you sharing your story, you give so many other people permission to share their stories too. And we really value you, and we appreciate that. If you have the story that you would like to share, please feel free to pop it in the chat. If you have a story you'd like me to share anonymously for you, pop a direct message to me in the chat, and I'm happy to share that anonymously for you too. We really do appreciate that. There are some numbers on screen as well, should you need some support with a situation that you're going through right now. Professor, I think I'd love to come to you. I'd love to hear from you, because you talk a lot about how money can so easily turn from a medium of care to actually a medium of abuse, particularly when that comes to joint bank accounts. Can you talk specifically a little bit about the research and your findings in this area?
Thank you so much. And first, I want to say, Lula, I can understand your tears. I myself am a victim survivor. And with other women, when we spoke, even 20 years later, it hits, because it has sort of gone deep into your soul, as it were, and you didn't know what was happening. And Meggie, that's what's happening, say, with the joint account. You go into a joint account, particularly if you're an Anglo-Celtic person, thinking that you're doing the right thing. This is a symbol of marriage. It's a symbol of partnership. And then you find that the man actually is using the joint account, and your joint account where only your money is there, he's not providing. So the joint account then, when it lacks the morality of partnership and consultation and togetherness, then becomes the number one beautiful medium, as it were, to be able to monitor a woman's expenditure, to be able to take out the money, to be able to borrow against it. And it really hit me, because way back in 1990, I myself had written about the joint account as this great symbol of partnership, of Anglo-Celtic marriage. But then what really struck me is that this is not just something that happens with the joint account in Anglo-Celtic marriage. It happens with remittances in the global South, and India, China, Africa, the Pacific. And again, I had sent money home and thought of it as a moral filial act. It's fated in remittance literature as one of the largest international flow of funds, 3 times that of official development aid, and more than 50% more than official direct investment, or that foreign direct investment.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then you hear women speaking of it, not as economic abuse, but just mentioning that he sent all his money and some of her earnings without consultation. She is working 3 jobs. And then other women saying, just before the marriage broke, he went to India and he took all his money with him, investing it in assets, meaning it's no longer part of joint income and assets.
It's and Professor, I want to ask you something, because we've just had something come through in the chat, and I'd love to hear from you and Lula on this, specifically about people here today only now in the last few minutes realizing that actually they've experienced financial abuse. And I know, Supriya, for you, that was something that you realized a lot later. Like, and I'm interested to know, for people who think, oh, something's not quite right, or like, what advice would you give, Professor, for people who are listening, or for people who have friends or family members who they're worried about? Do you have any advice for them?
Absolutely. Think about money as a channel of freedom, as a medium of intimacy. And don't think it is something wrong with you, that it only happens to women who don't know how to manage money. Say, Lula and I was totally independent before marriage. I was highly educated, didn't recognize that gambling was a medium of economic abuse. I thought something's wrong with him. And don't be embarrassed talking about it, because money is not supposed to be something that demeans you. Money is the way you progress your life and become the person you want to be.
Such wonderful words there. And I really appreciate it, Supriya. Earlier, you said, don't think of this as something that's wrong with you. I think a lot of people are grateful for you saying that. Lula, we know that financial abuse is a huge barrier for women leaving abusive relationships. Why do you think that is?
Picking up on what Professor said, it's a means to independence and freedom. If you don't have the access to your money or to any money and resources, how do you find housing? How do you pay for childcare? How do you pay the bills? How do you pay the groceries? If you haven't been on the lease or you don't have a credit history, how do you speak to your bank about what you can do and how you can gain access to funds? If your name is on a joint account where both names have to be approved for things, how do you navigate that when you don't have the same standing in the relationship? And I think what a lot of our policies that are well-intentioned, like joint accounts are, to provide an equal footing for women and men, actually don't recognise the disadvantage of power dynamics within a relationship that exists between men and women, and those stereotypes that women are seen as unreliable, not credible, men are the ones who are the responsible ones, and there's these ideas about women being hysterical, flighty. All of that pays into whether we believe women and see them as credible actors. Women just simply don't have yet, unfortunately, in society, the same freedoms and independence that men do to exercise within their relationships most of the time. And I think for myself, I like to come back to what's called the equality wheel, which I think we can share with people. It's acts of non-violence. And in economic partnership, money-making decisions are made together, making sure both partners benefit from financial arrangements. And the other part that I think we get stuck on in a kind of heteronormative Anglo-Saxon way of being is we think of equality as the same. But when men and women fundamentally do not earn the same amount of money based on feminized industries, based on working part-time, based on all of the gender stereotypes that women experience and impact our ability to earn the same amount as men, then contributing the same puts women at a continued disadvantage because we're not coming from the same level. So when we talk about equality and how we share our money and resources, it has to be so that people benefit equally from the shared resources, not that we contribute the same. That's another snag that I see people getting stuck into. Oh, we're in a relationship, we'll pay half the rent, except that leaves you with this much income at the end of it and him with this much income at the end of it. That's not fair. Equality has to be about fairness. So I think that's another principle I'd like people to come away with and understand. And you can negotiate that in your relationship. You should be able to have that discussion. I've had that with my current partner who lives far away. We need to fly to see each other. I don't earn the same amount of money as him. So we had to have that conversation and negotiate, well, how do we cover these costs? If we want to see each other, it's not actually fair to say we'll split it 50-50. And so we've looked at how we contribute more fairly to both equally benefit from our finances.
I appreciate you saying that, Lula, and thank you, Catherine, who's asking a similar question. And actually, Lula, I've got to say, it was my brother who taught me this. He was telling me, him and his partner, what they did was it was proportional, right? So they would pay rent proportional based on their income. That's how they decided to do it. So, you know, but to your point, it's an open conversation, isn't it? And it's a negotiation, right? And so I appreciate you saying that, Lula. Catherine, you know, something that's coming up a lot is joint bank accounts. And to be honest, before researching for this session, I hadn't known that they could actually be vehicles for abuse, financial abuse. They can also be wonderful things. I have had joint bank accounts in the past and it worked well in my relationships. But Catherine, you know, what are things that, I know that Westpac is very proactive in this space. What are some things that banks are doing to help eradicate this kind of abuse that we're seeing?
I think there's a few things to pick up on that point around joint accounts. They are, if you're getting joint credit together, sometimes it means you can actually buy a house together because you're pooling your income. It's a really great opportunity. But when you don't have a healthy money relationship, that's when the risks, where the risks lie. Or actually your relationship may sour over time and then abuse becomes a part of that relationship. So what we have seen is where some of our customers might be forced to apply for credit where they're going to receive no benefit. So they're forced to apply for a credit card, a personal loan, or even a home loan. And they might not have any benefit from that. I've seen a customer who we were supporting through our specialist team who supports customers experiencing domestic violence, where we could see that she had a personal loan in her name, but every payment from that loan went to her ex-husband's paying off his vehicles as part of his business. There was $18,000 of debt, and what she was trying to do was get her children back from overseas because he'd taken them away and she couldn't afford the legal fees. We were fortunately able to waive that debt for her and see that actually she didn't get any benefit from that loan. The other areas that we might see around joint debt in particular are where a partner may try to impair a joint borrower's credit history. What does that mean? When you take out a loan or when you apply for a loan, there's a register with the credit reporting agencies, and when you repay your debt on time, you get good scores. When you don't repay your debt on time, your score deteriorates over time. What we see in abusive relationships is that the perpetrator may not pay their proportion of the debt or any version of that debt, leaving somebody else with what's called sexually transmitted debt. They've got the liability for the loan and they're trying to meet their commitments, but the other person isn't pulling their weight, and so that's impairing their own credit history. That's devastating for somebody as they try to rebuild as well, because if you've got a poor credit history, it means that you may not be able to get further loans to help get a deposit for a rental property or get a credit card, those sorts of things. I would encourage people to talk to their banks, because we all have specialist teams that can provide some support and can work out how to tailor it for you. I wouldn't mind just mentioning one other element, which is where we see abusive messages in payment descriptions. So this has been something that I'm really proud that the banking industry has moved to respond to. But we see that people are sending each other, they're using bank accounts as a text messaging service. And so they're sending each other 1 cent, $1, $2 to send messages. And quite often it's a banter, it's jokes. Sometimes the language is pretty poor, but and I wouldn't be putting it in my bank account. But what we have seen is a really serious issue of people sending abuse, threats, intimidation through people's bank accounts. We put blocks in to try and block some of those words, and we have about more than 33,000 customers that we've said you have to change that language in real time. But we also send letters to customers who are sending those abusive messages saying, you need to stop, we can see you. And if you don't stop, we'll either suspend your access to internet banking or we will exit you from the bank. We know that that changes people's behaviour pretty quick smart.
Wow, I never knew about sexually transmitted debt. This is fascinating, Catherine. And I also didn't know that you could have an open conversation with your bank. And I'm sure that there's a lot of women out there, and Lula, you probably hear stories like this a lot of the time of people who think, I've got the debt, I've got to pay it off, which may be the case, but have that conversation. No matter who you bank with, if this is you, if this is your sister, if this is your best friend, please encourage them to pick up the phone and have a call if they feel safe to do so, or perhaps they could, leave the house and have that conversation. Lula, there's a lot of chat, and thank you to everyone who is sending through red flags that they have experienced or that they have observed. Lula, what would you say to people who are walking into a relationship and have the best of intentions and the best of hopes? Is there anything that you would give people advice about in terms of how can they set things up from the beginning for success and to hopefully avoid any semblance at all of financial abuse?
Well, I think for as long as is tenable, and doable in your relationship, keep your assets your own. Try not to share them. Women's financial independence and access to assets long-term is really important. That's tricky when you enter a marriage and the laws then start to split things 50-50 across the board. These are exceptionally well-intentioned laws, definitely made so that women benefited at the end if the relationship dissolves. Unfortunately, sometimes when you've got an abusive relationship, that ends up with, if we split super, then the man gets more super because the woman was technically earning more on paper, but he was benefiting from her finances the whole time. And at the end of that relationship, he then takes from her super because it's being split more in equitable under pools of funds. So you need to educate yourself about what the laws are, what the implications are. If you have a conversation with your partner where they start to it becomes uncomfortable for you to continue it about money, that's a big red flag for me in any ways. Gambling or hidden debts, all big red flags. You need to be able to have open discussions about this where you come to the party as equal parties and have an informed discussion about what you want to achieve, how you're going to get there. And there is no reason at all why you can't protect your own assets in that relationship. Say, look, this is mine. I've earned this to the point in our relationship. This is something I'm really proud of. I'm invested in this and I'm going to keep that for myself. Not because I disrespect you, but because that's mine. And we as individuals are coming to this relationship together to share our lives, not necessarily impede them. So if a man starts to behave like he's entitled to your assets, run. Sorry, just run.
Run for the hills if you see that.
Don't invest. No return on investment there. Get out.
No ROI in that instance. Lula, we so appreciate you sharing that. I can't believe how quickly this time has flown. We could talk about this for hours. But Supriya, you've had lived experience of that. You've researched this in incredible depth, and we're going to circulate some more of Professor's work afterwards because it's fascinating, the research that you've done. What would your final words be today for people who are listening, who want to protect themselves from financial abuse?
Listen, you need to talk about it with your partner, but not just before marriage, but through all life stages. And for the young women in my life, I tell them education and keep on in paid work. Without paid work and money of your own, a room of your own doesn't work. You do need money of your own, and talk about it. And as Lula said, if you cannot talk about it, why are you wanting to spend your life with that person?
Very poignant wisdom to leave us with, Supriya, today. We thank you so much. We thank you. We thank Lula. Catherine as well, thank you for the work that you do. Westpac is the only corporate member of the federal government's advisory board on the national plan, specifically to tackle this exact problem, right? Focusing on family and domestic violence. So we appreciate the work that you do and the advocacy that you're doing in this space. And Supriya, I know that, superannuation distribution is something that's important to you, and I completely agree with you. And I wish we'd had more time to touch on that, but do think about all those other things as well. If you are going your separate ways, don't forget that superannuation is an asset, that when you separate is something that you potentially are entitled to some of that. I've had friends who've left relationships and left it on the table, and they've regretted it down the line because they didn't have that financial independence that they would have otherwise had. So we will be sharing some more resources because there is some great information available on the Ruby Connection website. And we're going to share some support numbers as well. If this has triggered anything for you today, we really encourage you to reach out to the numbers provided. We will be sending you a follow-up email in a couple of hours. If we can do anything to support you as well, please just let us know. Speak to your banker. Have a conversation. If you're thinking there's something going on, if you have an inkling, start to have the conversation sooner rather than later, because your bank can potentially support you during that process as well. We thank you for giving your time today to have this conversation about financial abuse. It's not an easy conversation. And I know that a few people in the chat were talking about having this conversation with their children. And I would encourage you to do that this weekend. Not an easy conversation, but it's something that we need to start talking about more openly so that we can recognize the signs when we see it happening to us, our friends, families, or loved ones. So this has been, as always, a really fascinating conversation. There will be a recording of this going up, so you are welcome to circulate that to any friends who you think may find it valuable. And we are very excited to, in just a couple of weeks, be hosting our last Lunch and Learn series for the year. What a year it's been. So keep an eye out for that one as well. And we will be continuing the conversation online. Check out the Ruby Connection website for some more resources as well. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you. We thank you for sharing your stories. We know that it's not easy to talk about this, and we're really grateful to you all. Have a lovely weekend. Stay safe, and we will see you all in a couple of weeks.